You wake up in complete darkness. The air is thick and stale. You try to move, but your arms hit wooden walls just inches from your face. You scream, but no one can hear you. You're 6 feet underground, and everyone thinks you're dead. This nightmare was so real in the 1800s that people invented elaborate contraptions just to survive it. Bell systems, breathing tubes, and escape hatches became the difference between life and a horrifying death. What you're about to discover will change how you think about death itself. The year was 1791 in Manchester, England. Robert Robinson lay motionless in his coffin. But something was different. His family had installed a glass pane directly over his face, and a watchman checked daily for any sign of breath fogging the glass. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. Robinson's case represents one of the first documented attempts at what would become known as safety coffins. But why were people so terrified of being buried alive? The answer lies in a perfect storm of medical ignorance and deadly diseases that created the most horrific death imaginable. During the cholera outbreaks of the 1700s and 1800s, people would fall into death-like trances. Their breathing became so shallow that even doctors couldn't detect it. Their pulse would slow to almost nothing. To everyone around them, they appeared completely dead, but they weren't. They were trapped in their own bodies, unable to move or speak, watching helplessly as their own funeral was planned. The medical profession of the era was completely unprepared for these conditions. Doctors had no way to measure brain activity. They couldn't detect the faintest heartbeat. Their primary method of determining death was holding a mirror under the person's nose to check for breath. If the mirror didn't fog, the person was declared dead. This primitive method failed constantly. William Tebb, a British reformer, spent years documenting these cases. What he found was shocking. He recorded 219 cases of near-live burials and 149 full live burials where people were actually interred while still alive. Think about that number. 149 human beings buried alive because medical science couldn't tell the difference between death and a coma. But Tebb's numbers only represented the cases that were discovered. How many people died underground, clawing at their coffin lids, with no one ever knowing? The real number was likely much higher. Some estimates suggest that during peak cholera years, up to 2% of all burials involved living people. The fear became so intense that doctors gave it a name, taphophobia, the irrational fear of being buried alive. But here's the thing, it wasn't irrational at all. The evidence was everywhere. Eleanor Markham's case in 1894 proves just how real this threat was. She was pronounced dead and placed in a coffin. But during transport to the cemetery, the hearse driver heard something that made his blood run cold. Rattling, coming from inside the coffin. When they opened it, Eleanor was very much alive. She had been minutes away from being buried 6 feet underground. What made Eleanor's case particularly terrifying was that she had been examined by 3 different doctors. All 3 had declared her dead. If medical professionals could make such a catastrophic error with multiple examinations, no one was safe. Stories like Eleanor's spread like wildfire through newspapers and word of mouth. People demanded solutions, and inventors stepped up to provide them, seeing both a humanitarian crisis and a business opportunity. Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick was one of the first to take action. In 1792, he designed his own safety coffin. It included a glass window so people could see in, an air tube for breathing, and most importantly, he carried keys to unlock the coffin from the inside. Ferdinand was essentially building himself an escape route from his own grave. Ferdinand's design was born from personal experience. His own father had shown signs of life after being declared dead, and Ferdinand was determined not to suffer the same fate. His coffin was essentially an underground bunker with multiple backup systems. The air tube extended to the surface, the glass window allowed constant monitoring, and the keys gave him complete control over his own burial. 6 years later, a priest named P.G. Pessler suggested something even more ingenious. He proposed connecting a bell cable from inside the coffin to the church bells above ground. If someone woke up underground, they could ring for help. This idea would inspire countless inventors over the next century. Tesla's concept was revolutionary because it didn't require constant monitoring. The person underground could signal for help at any time, day or night. The church bells would wake the entire town, ensuring immediate response. It was a community-based solution to an individual problem, but it was Dr. Johann Taberger who created the first truly functional safety coffin system in 1829. His design was brilliant in its simplicity. Cords attached to the body would trigger a bell above ground if the person moved. Once the bell rang, watchmen would immediately pump air into the coffin through tubes while others began digging. Speed was everything. Even with air pumps, time was measured in minutes, not hours. Taberger's system represented the first industrialized approach to preventing live burial. He didn't just create a single coffin, he designed a complete system that could be mass-produced and installed in cemeteries across Europe. His business model was based on licensing the technology to funeral homes and cemeteries. However, Taberger's system had a fatal flaw. Decomposition could trigger the bells, creating false alarms. Imagine being a gravedigger, frantically digging up a coffin because the bell was ringing, only to find a rotting corpse. The gas buildup from decomposition could move the cords, making dead bodies appear to come back to life. This problem created a new nightmare for cemetery workers. They never knew if a ringing bell meant someone was alive, or if they were about to unearth a decomposing corpse. The psychological toll was enormous. Many cemetery workers quit rather than deal with the constant false alarms. Franz Wester solved this problem in 1868 with his burial case. His design included a viewing tube that allowed people to actually see the person's face before deciding whether to dig. This prevented unnecessary excavations and gave families peace of mind. Wester's system maintained air supply and provided a clear view of the person inside. It was a major improvement over earlier designs. Wester's viewing tube was made of brass and extended from the coffin to the surface. It included a glass lens at the top that could be opened for air circulation. The tube was angled to prevent water from entering during rain. Family members could look down the tube and see their loved one's face, checking for any signs of life or decomposition. The viewing tube also solved another problem: verification. With earlier bell systems, there was no way to know if the person was actually alive or if the mechanism had malfunctioned. The tube provided visual confirmation, reducing false alarms and giving families confidence that their loved one was truly at peace. Now here's where you need to hit that subscribe button, because what comes next shows just how far people were willing to go to avoid being buried alive. By 1897, Count Michel de Carnice had created what he called Le Carnice. This wasn't just a coffin, it was a complete underground survival system. The slightest movement would trigger a breathing tube, ring a bell, turn on a lamp, and raise a flag above ground. It was like a medieval panic room 6 feet underground. Carnice's system was incredibly complex. The breathing tube was spring-loaded and would automatically extend to the surface when triggered. The bell was connected to a mechanical system that would ring continuously until someone responded. The lamp was powered by a primitive battery system, and the flag was bright red to attract attention even from a distance. But Carnice's system was too sensitive. Body movement during decomposition triggered constant false alarms. Cemetery workers became exhausted from digging up empty coffins. The system that was supposed to save lives became a cruel joke. The oversensitivity problem plagued many safety coffin designs. Inventors were caught between making systems sensitive enough to detect the faintest signs of life and robust enough to avoid false alarms. Most erred on the side of sensitivity, creating systems that responded to every tiny movement, including the natural settling of decomposing bodies. Other inventors tried different approaches. Some created escape hatches that could be opened from inside. Others designed periscopes that allowed the buried person to see above ground. There were feeding tubes for long-term survival and even Morse code signaling systems. One inventor even experimented with electrical systems, though these proved unreliable and dangerous. The escape hatch designs were particularly interesting. They typically involved a hidden door in the side of the coffin that could be pushed open from inside. The door would lead to a small chamber with a ladder extending to the surface. The person could climb out and literally dig their way to freedom. Feeding tubes were designed for long-term survival underground. The inventors understood that rescue might take days, so they created systems that could sustain life for extended periods. These tubes could deliver water, liquid food, and even medicine to the buried person. Morse code systems represented the most sophisticated communication method. The buried person could tap out messages to people above ground, providing detailed information about their condition and needs. This eliminated guesswork and allowed for more targeted rescue efforts. The variety of solutions shows just how desperate people were. Over 30 different safety coffin designs emerged during the 1800s, mostly in Germany, where the fear was strongest. Each inventor thought they had solved the problem, but reality was far more complex. German inventors dominated the field because Germanic countries had the highest rates of cholera and other diseases that caused death-like trances. The combination of medical ignorance and frequent epidemics created a perfect storm of live burial incidents. The London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was founded in 1896 by William Tebb and Walter Hadwin. This wasn't just a support group. It was a lobbying organization. They pushed for legislative reform, mandatory death certification, and widespread adoption of safety coffins. They understood that individual solutions weren't enough. The entire system of death verification needed to change. The association published detailed reports documenting live burial cases across Europe and America. They interviewed families who had discovered their loved ones weren't actually dead. They worked with medical professionals to develop better methods of determining death. They lobbied governments to require longer waiting periods before burial. The association's work was crucial because they documented the real scope of the problem. They weren't dealing with isolated incidents. This was a systematic failure of medical science that was killing people in the most horrific way possible. Their most important contribution was standardizing death certification. They pushed for laws requiring multiple doctors to examine a body before declaring death. They advocated for mandatory waiting periods of 24 to 48 hours before burial. They promoted the use of stethoscopes to detect faint heartbeats. But here's the shocking truth about all these elaborate safety coffin designs. Despite dozens of patents and hundreds of installations, there is no documented case of anyone ever being saved by a safety coffin. Not one. This raises a disturbing question. Were these devices actually useless? Or were people dying in them before anyone could respond to the bells? The answer lies in understanding what really happens during live burial. Modern forensic science shows that a person buried alive has approximately 5.5 hours of air in a standard coffin. But panic uses oxygen faster. Fear makes people breathe rapidly. In reality, most people would have much less time. The panic factor cannot be overstated. Imagine waking up in complete darkness, unable to move, with wooden walls pressing in around you. The natural human response is to hyperventilate, which rapidly depletes the available oxygen. Most people would lose consciousness within an hour, long before rescue could arrive. Even with bells ringing above ground, digging up a coffin takes hours. The safety coffins provided psychological comfort, but they couldn't overcome the basic physics of suffocation. The ground had to be cleared, the coffin located, and the heavy wooden box lifted to the surface. By the time rescuers reached the coffin, it was almost always too late. The real solution came from advancing medical science. Embalming became standard practice, making live burial impossible. Stethoscopes allowed doctors to detect heartbeats they couldn't hear before. Legal reforms required longer waiting periods before burial. Death certification became more rigorous. Embalming was the ultimate solution because it made live burial physically impossible. The process involved removing all blood from the body and replacing it with preservative chemicals. No one could survive this procedure. Once embalming became standard, the fear of live burial disappeared almost overnight. By the early 1900s, safety coffins were becoming obsolete, not because they worked, but because they were no longer needed. Medical advances had eliminated the root cause of the problem. The phrase "saved by the bell" is often connected to these coffin bells, but this is likely a myth. The phrase predates safety coffins and probably comes from boxing, where a bell could save a fighter from being knocked out. However, the cultural impact of safety coffins extends far beyond their practical use. Edgar Allan Poe's The Premature Burial in 1844 captured the public's terror and made live burial a central theme in horror literature. Modern horror films still use this fear. The 2018 movie The Nun featured bell systems, and countless horror stories use the terror of being trapped underground. Poe's story was particularly effective because it combined the real fear of live burial with supernatural elements. His vivid descriptions of waking up in a coffin terrified readers and helped cement live burial as one of humanity's greatest fears. The safety coffin represents something deeper than just a failed invention. It shows how fear can drive innovation, even when that innovation is ultimately pointless. These devices were elaborate solutions to a problem that medical science was already solving through other means. They also reveal something disturbing about human nature. The inventors who created these systems weren't just trying to save lives. They were profiting from people's deepest fears. Patent records show that many safety coffin designers marketed their products aggressively, using fear-based advertising that would make modern marketers blush. The marketing materials for safety coffins often included graphic descriptions of live burial and testimonials from families who had discovered their loved ones weren't actually dead. These ads played on people's worst nightmares to sell products that had never actually saved anyone. The cemetery workers who maintained these systems tell a different story. They describe the constant false alarms, the exhaustion of digging up empty coffins, and the psychological toll of working in graveyards filled with bells that might ring at any moment. For them, safety coffins weren't comfort. They were a nightmare. Many cemetery workers developed their own form of trauma from dealing with safety coffin systems. They lived in constant fear of missing a genuine alarm, knowing that their negligence could result in someone dying underground. The responsibility was overwhelming, and many workers suffered from what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders. But there's something else about these safety coffins that historians are just beginning to understand. Recent archaeological discoveries have found scratch marks inside coffins that predate the safety coffin era. Deep gouges in the wood made by fingernails, torn fabric from burial clothes, evidence that people were indeed waking up underground and fighting desperately to escape. The question isn't whether people were being buried alive. The question is, how many people died this way before anyone realized what was happening? And in some remote parts of the world, where modern medical certification still doesn't exist, this medieval nightmare might still be.